You've found AHO Radio. We're authentic human outliers coming together to help heal the fear of being authentic. To bring back genuine human conversation. No hype, no sensationalism, just honest talk about the critical issues affecting society, affecting humankind. And now, here are the hosts of AHO Radio, John Krotec and Bill Protzmann. And a very good day to all of you listening and watching around the world. Bill Protzmann here with Music Care and my co-host John Krotec over there on the east coast of our United States. Good morning, John. How are you?
Hey, you know, every time I hear those drums, it just gets me going. And yeah, I'm no longer on the west coast of Florida. I'm in transit now and super excited about our guest today, who is doing some amazing things with human interest stories and actually letters.
Oh my gosh.
The Legacy Project, the Center for American War Letters, Andrew Carroll.
Good morning,
Andrew.
Andrew.
Great to be with you guys. Thank you so much.
Andrew, what's it like to actually hold a letter that's over 100 years old in your hands and like read the very intimate stuff that's written there in wartime? That's just...
people have shared with me 160,000 war letters from the Revolution to the present day. And I actually pulled out some of my best to show your audience, how this project got started and really historic things that that people so generously share with us. We don't buy or sell letters. Everything is donated, and then we archive them and use them for all sorts of different projects.
This is so cool. Awesome. And those letters are available, because I saw the New York Times article yesterday, virtually, like you can take a virtual tour, right?
Now, so we're creating the Museum of American War Letters. The first wing was dedicated to Vietnam. There are a lot of reasons for that, especially because yesterday was National Vietnam War Veterans Day. And we just had so many incredible letters on different types. Like we had typed letters, handwritten letters. This is the really cool thing. We have audio letters by Colonel Patton. So that's the son of the great World War II general. Wow. He too was in the military, and he sent these audio letters back and forth to his wife, and the Patton family shared those with us. So you can actually hear Colonel Patton telling, about this horrible day of losing men and so forth, but also you can hear the artillery going off in the background. Wow. So if you just go to our website, warletters.us, which I'll repeat numerous times, it has how to, enter the museum, our podcast, how to donate letters, all that stuff is on there. So it's warletters.us, not .com.
All good.
That's awesome. And well, the cool thing about those letters is that they are first person. And, I was reading a Civil War letter, a guy that eyewitnessed Pickett's charge. And the aftermath of that great, advance on the Union at Gettysburg. And it almost, and Andrew, you've read so many of these letters and you've allowed people access that you actually put the reader or those interested right there on the battlefield or around the battlefield. So that's phenomenal. Kudos to you, man, for carrying on a tradition of great worth to society.
Oh, I feel so blessed. I love what I do. I love working with the military, veterans. I've gotten to travel the world, went to Iraq, went to Afghanistan. So this has been, and this is someone who hated history growing up. Like I was not one of those kids who wanted to go to battlefields. I was like bored to tears by those things. I was an English major, hated history. And then my house burned down, or my dad's house in Washington, and we lost everything. And it was losing the letters. That was so... that was the worst part of it. Nobody was hurt. And, all those irreplaceable items of family memorabilia, photos, letters, etc., just literally up in smoke.
So, Andrew, what do you think it is about us, like human beings, that want to hold on to those things, those artifacts of our ancestry? What makes us want to do that?
Well, and that's why letters are so great, because there's this tangible connection where I only have a distant cousin who served in the military. A lot of people are the sons of daughters of veterans and so forth. Or grandchildren. And it's like you're holding that letter that your grandmother wrote when she was a war nurse in World War II. And her description of losing patients and the impact it had on her. We have letters like that. You're like, even if you never really knew that grandmother or you never saw that side of her. And one of the things I love the most, I hear this all the time, like, we're doing a big spring cleaning. I mean, everyone's inside because of the pandemic and so forth. But in fact, we've seen a huge uptick in donations because people are going through their family memorabilia. They hear about us and they send us their war letters. And, they'll come across their parents' love letters from when they were like 20, 21, courting, when he was off, going to Vietnam or Korea or whatever. And they're like, I never knew that side of my parents. Like, they were funny. They were like, you know, poetic, and they were, you know, joyful. And, or, you know, I just knew my grandfather is this old curmudgeonly guy and, you know, very grumpy. But then I read his love letters to my grandmother, and it's like, they're incredible. And it's like, what happened to that guy?
Yeah.
And so it really is, it's an extraordinary insight into your own family.
That's awesome. And, you know, you're right. It's the connection. And, you know, I have a poem out of the letters we talked a little bit earlier, but I have a poem that was written from an NCO in the 28th Alabama Infantry Regiment, and he wrote it on his deathbed. And wow, it's a phenomenal letter. Now you're giving me ideas about how I can donate it. So at the end of the show, let's let the listeners know how, if they've got something like that, how they can give it to your project.
Yeah, and just we don't have the original to this; it's in another archive. But you just remind me that I published a letter for the first time. A guy who was in Ford's Theater when Lincoln was assassinated, and described what it was like. I mean, he was like just, you know, a stone's throw from the president, and describing the pandemonium and everything that happened. I mean, it's incredible. And I wish we had the original, but we were able to publish it for the first time in a book I did many years ago. And it's just as you said, it's this eyewitness account. We actually have, if I can do a little show and tell, sure, 2 letters that are really incredible. This one, I got chills when I first received it. It starts, "Dear Sis, it's now 9:05 a.m. Sunday morning, and we've been bombed now for over an hour. Our anti-aircraft guns are yammering away, and every so often a bomb strikes so close as to rock this ship. Upper corner, Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, USS New Orleans. This sailor was trapped in the forward engine room of a ship at Pearl Harbor, and because he couldn't go anywhere, he just picked up the ship's stationery and started writing this handwritten account of what it was like." And very similar, another worst day in American history. This is an eyewitness account. It's a letter written by a woman who survived 9/11. She was in one of the buildings next to the Twin Towers. She was one of those people who was caught up in the debris and the smoke, and she would have died if one of her coworkers didn't take off his coat, put it over her head, and then got her underneath a vehicle. So the wave of you know, the smoke and the debris went past them. But what's interesting is, I know it's kind of hard to hear, it's hard to see, but there are these kind of blur marks on the paper. And I asked Anna, who wrote this, you know, did you just spill like a little coffee on it? She said, no, those were my tears, because I was sobbing as I was recalling, you know, this extraordinary day. So anyway, it's just, you know, and this is one of our most famous letters. But it's just really, you know, you talked about holding the original. So this young soldier was at the invasion of Anzio in World War II, and he's describing to a fellow soldier how he almost died. A shell dropped right next to him, but it was a dud. So he puts the letter in his rucksack, talking about this near-death experience. He was shot through the back moments later. That's the bullet hole from the casing went through the paper and into him. Fortunately, he survived. But again, it just gives you an idea of literally the life and death circumstances under which these troops were living.
That's great. You know, and Andrew, it's funny, man, that you say that, and you too, Bill, that you guys weren't even really interested in history. But these letters, these firsthand accounts, that right there, those 3 letters that you just shared, I know we're going to share more, that gives you the substance of, you know, the human interest and the authenticity, which we all talk about. But these people that went through these harrowing experiences and were able to record it. And now what you've been able to do is you've been able to share that and offer that to the world. And
well, it's very kind of you to say that, but it's because people have been so generous. I mean, this is, just to show you one quick example, because we do have letters from current conflicts, mostly emails, which are fine. We love those. This is a letter written before the first battle at Tora Bora. So this is the first battle in the global war on terrorism, just after 9/11, and in Afghanistan. And it's this handsome young soldier, Josh Harapko, who was writing to his mom. And the purpose of the letter was in case he was killed in battle, that he wanted her to know how much he loved her. So it was definitely a "in case I die" letter. So Josh survived, and it's handwritten. Josh survived Afghanistan. A year to the day that he wrote this letter, he was up at Fort Drum in New York, routine training mission. He was in a helicopter, malfunctioned, crashed, and he was killed. And so this is still kind of the last letter he wrote to his mom. And I'm just getting to the point of how generous she gave this letter to us. And it's like, can you imagine the sentimental value of that? But she wanted to make sure that, you know, it was preserved forever, that it wasn't thrown away, you know. And we get that a lot from people saying, you know, like, I really want to give you the originals, which we like, because I'm afraid that they're just going to be lost. You know, some generation is going to see this box in the attic and toss it out. And we are going to preserve everything forever.
That's awesome.
I'm sort of speechless over here, which is tough because I've got to ask a poignant question or something, you know. And instead of that, what I'm feeling right now is just well, the absolute genuine honesty that is in these letters. My uncle recorded one and during Vietnam. He was watching his buddies get shot out of the sky over there, and he didn't know. And he recorded like his last letter, right? If he was gonna get shot down that night, and you hear in his voice this kind of weight that goes along with doing your sworn duty to our country, and also a level of authenticity. And it's like a terrible word to use, authenticity, right now. But what you know, I'm trying to figure out what I want to ask you here, Andy. There is something that's holy about preserving these communications, and I think the way that it got to me the most honestly was knowing that I've read my parents' love letters. They're both gone now, but knowing that these people, mom and dad, had this side that I never saw,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
only is revealed in their private communications. And that's like an enormous responsibility for you, man, to
Well,
be the curator of that.
and yeah, I want to follow up with you about those recordings. I would love to know if it's possible for us to get a copy of it.
Oh, I wish. It's been gone for years. I heard it
Yeah.
in the 70s, you know, so.
Yeah, and that's exactly what the Pattons were doing. Colonel Patton and his wife were sending this back and forth. We have a lot of letters, and I think this is why I even though I didn't like history, focused on war letters ultimately, is because just as you said, there's an authenticity that every word you write could be your last. You know, so they're intentional last letters, and then there are letters where you're like, you know, just in case. And I think the love letters are more profound. The letters about faith are more philosophical. They're very funny letters. Troops are trying to, this is how they break the monotony of war, or just, keep their sanity, is tell funny stories or whatever. And I actually have some examples of those I can share, but it's just, you have the full range of human emotions, and they're just all made more vivid through the spectrum of warfare, or through the prism of warfare. It's, they intensify all of these emotions, even with censorship. You still have these really profound correspondences.
Did you know that was going to be a component of this when you got started with the project, or did it sneak up on you?
It snuck up on me, and I think, I was really thrown because this was not meant to be my life's mission. Which I mean, this is beyond a passion or a calling. It's like I can't wait to get up every day and see what new letters are coming in, and every time I think I've exhausted a subject matter, someone surprises me with something brand new, and it's just so, again, ironic that I hated history, but now it's something that has really become all-consuming in the best way possible. And again, I just feel so fortunate to get to work with people who, in the military, and veterans who share these correspondences, and their families. A lot of people who aren't in the military, have war letters. And I was focusing on a project that gave away books to promote literacy. That was my past life. And after our fire, a distant cousin of mine sent me a letter he wrote when he was in World War II. This is the actual copy of it. And it's dated April 21st, 45. And he's describing walking through a Nazi concentration camp at the end of World War II. And he had forgotten he wrote this letter. And I was just saying, Jim called about the fire. I said, we're all okay, but we lost all of our letters and so forth. And he said, I just came across the letter that I wrote when I was 23 years old, completely forgot about it. I'll send it to you. And so I get it, this incredibly powerful letter. I call him back. I say, Jim, this is one of the most remarkable things I've ever read. And of course, I'll return it to you. And he said, keep it. I would have thrown it out anyway. So here you have this eyewitness account of the Holocaust. And as I'm sure you guys know, General Eisenhower ordered U.S. troops to go through the camps and serve as eyewitnesses, because he knew then people would later say this never happened. And so, we had this incredible account, and that was kind of the spark of like, well, I'm not so much interested, this is 20 years ago, I'm not so much interested in the history part of it, but this is just like great literature. I mean, it's a very powerful piece of work. And I just kept talking to veterans about, hey, what do you do with your letters? And more they were saying, oh, we toss them. And so that was the idea to start this project, to encourage Americans, whether you're a veteran or not, if you have war letters, please save them and ideally share them with our project.
That's awesome. I think the reason and the impact of the letters is probably different for everybody. My dad was an Army officer for 28 years. I'm an Army veteran. And I remember very distinctly as a young child, he used to drag me to all those battlefields. We were at the Battle of Spotsylvania. We were standing right on the area called the Mule Shoe, where it was sustained combat for over 20 hours. The bodies were 10 high. And I remember my dad describing it, like, here is this Army officer describing it to me as if he was there. And this is crazy, Andrew. And I said to my dad, I said, as a young boy would, I said, why would people on the same side from the same country fight each other? You know, he's describing the battle like he's there, right? Yeah. And I think this is where my love of country came in. And he whacked me upside the head, I remember. And he said, son, there are some things in life that are bigger than you. And he says, and one of them is America. So what struck me at that time was, for me, these letters is all about the sacrifice, not only the human story, but the sacrifice that these people went through to allow us the pleasure of being an American citizen with freedoms.
And John, you know, that's what you just said is so resonant, because on the one hand, I think we kind of take for granted this notion of, you know, he volunteered his life or whatever. I mean, to really step back and be like, what if right now you were in a situation where someone said, to help save America, we're going to have to kill you right now. It's like, wait, that's way too real. You know, so we often, especially civilians, kind of think of war in the abstract, like, oh yeah, they volunteer to serve. That's great. But it's like, these people are stepping forward to say, I will literally give up my life for, as you said, a greater cause. And the other thing that we really try and do with this project, and you mentioned the word sacrifice, and to me, the two key words for this entire project are sacrifice and humanizing. So the sacrifice goes beyond risking your life. As you know, it's the time away from loved ones. It's the strain on relationships. We have letters by fathers who couldn't be there when their child was born and wrote a letter to that young infant. So those are all the sacrifices that people like me as a civilian just weren't aware of. And so that's what we're trying to raise awareness about. It's not just giving, you know, risking your life or getting permanently wounded. And then finally, with the humanizing thing is, I really think those of us who are civilians just see the troops as like statistics. You know, okay, yeah, 10,000 just, you know, went over for this part of the world, or 5,000 are stationed here. Every single one of those individuals is a human being, and a spouse, a parent, a child, you know, whatever it may be. And that's what the letters do, is that they really bring their voices to life and help us individualize and humanize them and really see them for who the extraordinary people that they are.
That's awesome, man. Even in peacetime, I can remember when I was stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado, we'd be out in a foxhole, you know, 20 degrees below zero with the wind chill. And we'd be smoking and joking, as we would say. And we would watch these airliners going above, and we would all joke, I wonder what cocktails they're ordering the people sitting next to the galley. And, you know, thank God I never had to go to combat. We were trained up for it. I have friends that have gone and friends that have died, but it is a sacrifice, and you don't think about it. And I used to think to myself, gosh, I signed up for this. I could be at Club Med, you know, but here I am in the middle of the freaking cold weather training in Colorado, Pinyon Canyon, thinking about all the things I could be doing. But you know what? I'm glad that I did serve my country. And I'm glad that guys like you are serving, but in a different way. And by you humanizing the sacrifices of these letter writers, oh my gosh, Andrew, you were right up in there with us, man.
No, well, that's very kind of you to say. One of my favorite quotes is by Will Rogers, the old humorist. He said, we can't all be heroes. Someone's got to be on the curb clapping as the real heroes go by. So I feel like that's our role, like, you know, to remind people, and you know, it's just been such an incredible experience. And again, I just feel almost more passionate about it as every day goes by, because, you know, again, like whether we're launching the new virtual museum or we're doing a podcast called Behind the Lines, which is also on our website, warletters.us. It's just, there are all these new ways of getting these letters out to people and seeing how they're reacting to it. And that's what we want, is to really help them, you know, connect and to understand this is what it means, just whether it's peacetime, there's sacrifices made, wartime, of course. And also we focus on the home front too. We have incredible letters and emails by the spouse. I don't even say the wives now, because now it's the women who are going off to serve and the men are back home taking care of the kids. But, you know, it's very important to have that home front experience. It's often the loneliest and most stressful post in any war. You are always terrified of either that phone call or that government issued vehicle driving up and those two officers coming out, the casualty notification officers. You know, and I know guys who do that, and they've seriously said, I would rather have been sent back into combat than tell one more mother that, you know, her son or daughter was not coming home alive.
I'm thinking of the movie Taking Chance.
That's actually based on a book I edited, called Operation Homecoming. And I'll let you. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
No, no,
it's
no. That's the lead in. So you picked it up.
yeah. So it's this story about this Marine officer who's tasked with sort of accompanying the body of a fallen service member all the way, from Iraq, and then I think to Dover, where they properly bury, not bury, but they put the decorations back on the body and the uniform and so forth, and then escorting it on a commercial airline, and then just getting it to the funeral home where the family was. And he kind of went about it at first not really invested in it, but by the time he got to the family and the funeral, he talks about how hard, he's like, I felt he was like a brother that I was letting go of.
That's
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the home front too, because when you talk about sacrifice, Andrew, that's pretty astute, because there's sacrifices made at home too. And those letters equally, to me, they're equally as important, because it's a two-way street. The people that support those men and women who are in uniform in a combat environment, they couldn't do that without the families back home writing the letters. And I can only imagine being in the jungles of, Vietnam, somewhere in Cambodia or something, and getting those letters from a home, and then having those letters archived so people can see how important that was to get that kick in the rear to bring the spirits up. That's awesome, man.
And obviously, we're going through this pandemic. We have tons of letters written during World War I, during that pandemic. And you have soldiers hearing word that their wife has just passed away from the virus back then, and it could literally have been written today. I mean, it's just the echoes are just so strong of what it was like. So we captured that period, and you have letters on the home front, being like, we just lost, Aunt Sue to the influenza pandemic. And it's really tough right now over here, and troops were dying overseas of the virus and so forth. So it is, it's sad to see a century later, how much we're all losing and what it costs society.
I have it's a tough question to ask, but in the light of what happened with Vietnam veterans and celebrating Vietnam War Veterans Day yesterday, hopefully we've changed. But I have this sort of curiosity about the War Letters Project. Have you encountered any resistance, Andy?
No, I've been doing this for over 20 years. And even in this toxic environment that we're living in politically, everything else, I mean, I'm really shocked. I mean, so early on, I got a few death threats because a lot of our early letters were about the Holocaust, because my cousin's letter was about Buchenwald. So, and in fact, let me come back to your point and remind me if I kind of go astray. I just want to show people what's probably our most, well, they're all valuable, but this is really quite extraordinary. So this is written May 2nd, 1945. And it's a young American soldier named Horace Evers. He's a staff sergeant, and he's in Munich with his men at the end of World War II, and they're kind of mopping up. And so they need to send up a base of command base. And they walk into this one incredibly, just luxuriously furnished apartment. And they realize, and I won't use the expletive, but holy blank, we've just walked into Hitler's private Munich residence. Now, Hitler committed suicide the day before, and in Berlin, but this is like Hitler's real home. This is what he considered his real residence. And so Horace Evers walked up to Hitler's desk, and there was just a stack of Hitler's personal stationery. This is the actual piece of paper with the gold embossed Adolf Hitler. And on this stationery, he wrote about Dachau, which just like my cousin, he had walked through. And he's describing to his mom and dad the horrors of Dachau compared to the obscene luxury that Hitler and his thugs were enjoying at that time. So anyway, just to get back to your point, so that letter, when we got it 20 years ago, got a lot of attention. And so I had a couple neo-Nazis who said, that's a fraud, you're a fake, you're, and we're going to end your lying at some point. But I mean, we've never had any kind of political, like, oh, you're pro-war, you're anti-war, you're this. It's like, we're pro-service members and pro-families. That's what we're trying to do. We're not coming down in a partisan way, a political way. We have letters that run the gambit. We've got very patriotic letters, and we have, intensely, like, especially in Vietnam, like, why the blank am I over here? So we just let the letters speak for themselves. That's to me and trying to be as fair and proportional. And it's funny you mentioned this, Bill. Literally just yesterday, I had a woman call me and say, I have letters by a conscientious objector, but you probably don't want those because, no, of course we want that side of it. And it's not that this was from World War II. It's not that this guy didn't want to serve in some way. He just didn't want to kill people. So he's like, put me in an ambulance thing. I'll do whatever you want. But, I'm a Quaker and these are my beliefs. So, but she thought that we might not want them because, again, they're not, war letters. I'm like, they're very much war letters.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a great question, because you could see people say, well, he's glorifying war. He's bringing this stuff up for whatever reason. I read a Kentucky poem written by a woman during the Civil War. It's called My Poem for a Dark-Eyed Soldier Boy. And she wrote it. It's 4 or 5 stanzas, and I'm going to get it to you. And those are the only 2 poems the only 2 letters I kept for these poems. And it basically, she mailed it to him. He didn't survive. He was killed at the crater, the Battle of Petersburg. But the letter made it back in his personal effects back to this woman in Kentucky. And I was able to acquire it through the collecting of letters. And I just thought that was phenomenal. The woman was very, very, very articulate and creative and talented. And it showed me a side that was just beyond words. Like Bill was saying, he's speechless. And when you're like the letter you just shared, those letters, that's reality. That's what really happened. That was the perception. That was the event. And it's so poignant to see Hitler living like that when millions of people died in those concentration camps. So it is important, and conscientious objector or not, they're equally important. You're right.
I mean, it's preserving, chronicling history, and that's part of the historical record.
Yeah.
So what do you have? Can you read an anti-war letter? Do you have one?
I don't have one handy, but I'll tell you what, it's funny you mentioned that. It's not anti-war. In fact, I'm really glad that you mentioned that. So this is by an African-American service member. I think he was one of the Tuskegee Airmen. It's from World War II. And a friend of his wrote to him overseas, envious that he was experiencing history. And this is what he wrote back. Dear Sylvia, you say that you wish you were over here. Although most people think they are war conscious, are they really? So far removed from the far-flung battlefronts, how can they be? You are really war conscious when you see the airplanes in formation early in the morning, flying to meet their rendezvous, and then this same formation returning in the evenings. But the number is not the same. 12 went out, but only 9 returned. You stand there looking up, watching them fly into the distance, into part of the horizon and disappear. You wonder, what really did happen? Those who went down in flames. Do they die as you see them in the movies? I don't think so. Not with a smile on their lips and a happy gleam in their eyes, but rather painfully, and with the knowledge that this is it. You'd have to see the wounded streaming back from the front after battle to see the light go out of men's eyes. People may think they know what war is like. Their knowledge is facts to the mind. Mine is the war-torn body, scared to soul's depth. When I was in the States, war was far away, unreal. I had read, I had seen pictures, but now I know. Oscar. So that's from an actual service member who is like, and you got to the word that we avoid is never glorify this. You can glorify the heroism of our troops and laud them for that, but war itself is, what we try and show the stark reality of, and it's through the details. We have a letter by a war nurse who was on a ship that was bombed, and I won't go into it because it's very graphic, but she describes how one nurse couldn't get out of her room and she burned alive. And you can just tell that this nurse is just getting this off of her. I mean, she has to write about it because it's almost cathartic to get this horrific memory down on paper and almost out of her head. But it's just, those are the sorts of letters. We have a play called If All the Sky Were Paper. And I love, and we've had Annette Bening and Laura Dern and Common and all sorts of prominent people. And to me, to see famous actors bring these letters to life, and we have them in the podcast too, is just such an incredible experience.
Give us a little bit more on the podcast, as long as this is a great point to bring that in.
Yeah, so it's called Behind the Lines, and you can find it on our website, warletters.us, but you can also go directly to behindthelines.us. And I'm doing it with Barbara Harrison, who's won 19 Emmys. She's an incredible journalist. And fortunately, before the pandemic, because I have a couple books out of war letters, the publishers had recorded very famous celebrities reading a lot of the letters for the audiobook. It was actually nominated for a Grammy. And so we have these hours of recordings of famous celebrities reading war letters. So Barbara and I play those, but then we talk about the letters, and I'll tell stories behind the scenes. Like one example, Kurt Vonnegut. I had actually just been to Dresden, and I was looking for war letters by civilians who had been there and during the firebombing. And I was reading Slaughterhouse-Five, just because I'm like, what better place to read about Dresden than Kurt Vonnegut, who lived through the firebombing as a POW. Ironically, the Germans had put the Americans down in this underground kind of meat, house, which was refrigerated. So they survived the firebombing. And so I read Slaughterhouse-Five, and I came back to the States, and I was talking to a small group of historians at a historical society. And one of them came up to me and I said, you just mentioned your trip to Dresden. Do you know about the letter that Kurt Vonnegut wrote about surviving the firebombing? I said, I don't think it exists, because I just read Slaughterhouse-Five, and he talks about how he relived his war experiences, and there's no mention of letters. And he said, yeah, Vonnegut forgot he wrote it. So, but I know the archive at Indianapolis, which is where Vonnegut was from. So I immediately called them. They said, yeah, we've had this letter sitting here. It's never been published. This is back when Vonnegut was alive. So I called a friend who knew him, we got in touch. He said, yeah, you have my permission to do the letter. And then he read the letter for the audio version. And you can hear that on the podcast in our inaugural episode. So you're hearing Kurt Vonnegut read what he wrote when he was like 22 years old, having just been liberated and having just survived the firebombing of Dresden. So that's what we do in the podcast is you'll hear Vonnegut, but then I'll tell the story about, how the letter came to be and all these different things, and then it had never been published or heard before.
That's cool, man. And brings it to life. I mean, like nothing else.
Yeah, exactly.
Andy, have you inspired any other nations to do this with their war letters? You have colleagues in other parts of the world?
We did. And pretty soon after we started, they've been doing it for a while. It's called CLIP, and it's the Canadian Letters and Images Project. And the folks who found it were very kind. They actually sent us letters saying, we just want to put on record that you helped inspire this. I did a almost 40-nation trip around the world, visiting war archives in other countries, and it was also my chance to go to Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we got a lot of press in those countries, and hopefully it inspired people to, like when I was in Paris, Le Monde did something. When I was in Russia, Vistia, one of the back then, not so sort of communist newspapers wrote about it. And it was just an incredible experience. And I hope this project continues to inspire people to preserve these extraordinary, irreplaceable, works of nonfiction.
That's a great question, Bill, and great work, Andy. One thing that we've even just talked about is, the perception of the other side, the war letters of the enemy. And, I think some of those would be probably very interesting as well. Have you had the opportunity to read any of those letters?
So my first book was called War Letters, and that was all American correspondence. And it was funny to me because when I was doing the book tour for that, so many veterans said to me, like, well, do you have any letters from, other countries? Not even enemies, but just like, of course, we were allies with the Russians during World War II, with the Brits, the Aussies, the Canadians, so forth, tons of allies. But also like, what were the Japanese kamikaze pilots writing as their last letter to their parents or whatever? I'm not so interested in the Nazi perspective. To me, there are some things like ISIS, Nazis, and so forth that, are pretty irredeemable, evil. But, in Vietnam, I mean, a lot of these guys were just farmers. They weren't, pro Ho Chi Minh or pro communism. They were just protecting their land. And so that's interesting with the Vietnam War too, is how many of the American troops were like, I couldn't bring myself to kill this guy because, he's not, one of these PAVN or Viet Cong, it's just a guy who's, trying to make sure his village isn't burned down. And so there are different levels of kind of, enemies and so forth. And also, the Brits obviously were the enemy during the Revolution. So it's fascinating to see what the British were writing during the Revolution, not just the American Continental Troops. So that became the book Behind the Lines. So same title as the podcast, but that book also had letters from around the world and then the stories behind them and how I got them as well.
This is
that Vietnam perspective. I play guitar with a Vietnam veteran, combat engineer, whose dad was actually a captain on Omaha Beach during D-Day.
Wow.
And he was telling me that the same thing. We've talked about Vietnam many times. He said, John, if America got invaded, you would do exactly what you just outlined, Andrew. You would pick up arms and you would protect your turf. And he said a lot of those, he goes, and that's why we questioned it so much. He said, I would go clear off a fire base, and then the captain would come in and he'd send me on a mission to go get beer down a Long Bend. And he said it was a juxtaposition of what are we really doing here? These people, what are we really doing? And that's a great perspective, because we forget that sometimes in the mire.
Yeah.
That's an interesting perspective, and you're keeping it alive, which again, without buttering your bread too much, keeps it very relevant.
Could I ask a question about the Japanese internment camps from World War II? We're, of course, for people who are going to be listening to this in the future, we're in this sort of fraught moment right now with Asian Americans. And I've actually visited a tiny little museum in Idaho where they're commemorating part of the Japanese internment in World War II. Have you had any letters around that from within our country, like actual Americans writing out of the camps?
So in both War Letters and Behind the Lines, the books, I actually have letters by Japanese Americans who are interned in camps. But I also, and this is like one of my favorite group of people, and I wish they would get more and more attention, the Japanese American 442nd Regimental Combat Team. These are the sons and daughters of people who are in camps, and they were actually in camps too when they were smaller, who volunteered to fight for this country. And they became one of the most highly decorated units in all of American history. And they were the ones who rescued the Lost Battalion, a group of non-Japanese American troops. And they lost more men rescuing the Lost Battalion than were in the Lost Battalion. So they're a really extraordinary group of individuals. And I think, if there's any time where they deserve more attention, it's now. And they really are. And so we have letters again that we publish by them. And I'm just so in awe of these guys who, I mean, again, when you guys are so good about sort of focusing on, one person's perspective, but think about it. You're in an internment camp. Your parents are in an internment camp. And yet you're like, I'm still going to fight for this country. And it's the same thing with African-American troops at that point. We have a letter where a guy who's back on leave, an African-American guy back on leave in the States, and he was talking about how the German POWs were being treated better than black men in uniform. That they had to go to the back of the restaurant or wherever to eat, whereas the white German POWs were essentially hobnobbing with other white American troops. And so again, I don't focus on African Americans, women, and so forth, just because it's a kind of historical, quota or something. We do it because these are extraordinary men and women, and their stories really need to be out there. And so I wish we had more letters by African American troops and women. And so, we always encourage people, please, if you have letters, we would love to, be able to preserve them. But it's again, they were sort of fighting on two fronts, and I think it makes them all the more heroic in what they did.
Like the Navajo code talkers.
Oh, I'm so glad you mentioned that. That's one of my show and tell. So
I knew somehow you had a letter, man. I knew that.
So Wilson Price, Marine, Navajo, he became one of the code talkers, and I was actually one of the first to publish a letter by a code talker. And it turns out Wilson Price volunteered for 3 wars. So his daughters very kindly gave us a collection of all of his letters from all the different wars, but this is just a sample. So we've got one from World War II, one from Korea, one from Vietnam. But that to me is one of the great stories of war. And actually, even in World War I, because I just did a book on Pershing and this First World War, there were the Choctaw code talkers, which I didn't know about. So it's just this, I'm sure all your listeners know the story, but just very briefly, that we use the Navajo language as part of our military code in the Pacific because it wasn't mathematical. There was no way to break the code unless you knew the Navajo language, which was an oral tradition. So it wasn't like there was a book in a Japanese library of Navajo language. And that's why the Navajo code talkers had a bodyguard, mostly to keep them alive. But if it seemed that a code talker might be captured and interrogated and so forth, was to execute him on the spot to spare him from that torture.
Incredible story. Yeah. So how can listeners find out about your books? Where can they go for those, Andrew? And then more about the Legacy Project and what you're doing now with the museum.
Yeah, so we've changed the name from the Legacy Project to the Center for American War Letters. We just felt it was a little more self-explanatory. And it's so simple, like our one-stop page for everything, the information about the play, information about the podcast. You can actually click on to hear the podcast there. And now the new virtual museum, it's all on warletters.us. So obviously, I think we've hammered home that we focus on war letters. And it is mostly an American project. So warletters.us. And, a lot of people may not have war letters, but they can still help us spread the word. So I actually was just talking to a Rotarian a few days ago, and he's like, well, I don't have any letters in my family, but the Rotarians have a lot of veterans in their civic organization. So I'm going to spread the word, or people do it through their, through their temple, their synagogue, their church. If there's a newsletter, if they can post things on Facebook, anything to direct attention to warletters.us helps us enormously. And that's just spreading the word. What you guys are doing, I know will generate incredible letters. And I'm so grateful to you all for having this opportunity.
Oh my gosh, Andy, what you're doing is just, it comes so close to home and reminds me of sort of a vulnerability that I didn't really possess before encountering this project, and finding and listening actually to the words these people wrote. It gets right to my heart.
Yeah, so humbled and honored to have you, Andrew. I love what you're doing, man. It's extraordinary. And the listeners out there, thank you for supporting the show and for listening to our guests, because these are some amazing human beings that are helping make the world a better place. And, Andrew's exposure to all of these letters, allowing us to see all these letters and have access to them, certainly makes life a lot more interesting and worthwhile, for sure. So,
you're so kind to say that, and we really want to reach out to the next generation to whom past wars are just not even a memory. They have no idea of them. And I think this is a way, whether I go to the Pentagon or to a high school and I show that bullet hole letter, everybody wants to come up and take a look at it, or the letter written on Hitler's stationery. And again, that's, sort of, we want to pay tribute to those who served, but for this generation, those to come, to better understand that very service.
Andrew, so if you had a mantra,
yes,
an Andrew Carroll mantra, based on all the letters that you've written, what would it be? What would you like people to understand about what it is that these letters mean?
So again, just going back to, sacrifice and humanizing, to show all the levels that these people, go through and so forth. But I do want to emphasize that, most of the letters are very serious. This is war, but we have some very funny letters too. And I don't know if we have time where I can show one example, but
go ahead.
Yeah. So this is a letter we got early on, and it's actually, I'm going to show you something else, because this is a recent acquisition. This isn't so much funny, but it's just fascinating. This is from World War I. And this lieutenant is telling his wife, he's in a hospital in Italy, how a new guy just came in, and he literally writes out, he had 247 wounds and from the machine gun fire, and they carved out a couple pounds of flesh from him. So that alone is pretty, like, oh my God, that's a lot. We find out the name of his new friend, Hemingway. So this is it's like, just in passing, 10 years before Hemingway is famous, this guy is just writing about his new kind of hospital buddy, Ernest Hemingway. And it's, again, I don't have access to the funny letter. I thought I did. The pile is getting a little out of control here. But it is just an example of, like, the fascinating little things that we find every single day embedded in these letters.
That's awesome, man. Thanks for sharing that and the other letters.
Yeah. Real people, like, doing real things that you never would have thought.
Yeah.
I mean, kids today probably have no idea when they're reading Hemingway in high school, that was him in World War II.
Yeah.
It's one of those things that just sort of comes home and takes up a special place in you that you wouldn't have opened otherwise.
Well, yeah. And again, I just feel so fortunate. And again, warletters.us, just getting the word out helps us enormously. And I get this question a lot. We focus on every single conflict in American history. So although the bulk of our letters are from World War II, because there's 16 million Americans served in that war, whether it's emails from Iraq, Afghanistan, or handwritten missives from the American Revolution, we cover it all. We have 160,000 letters already. I'd like to get up to about 250,000 before I pass. So that's my goal.
Hopefully we can help you get there.
Yeah, we can help you.
Letters. And just thanks for sharing all those. And I look forward to our next conversation. And Bill, always a pleasure with you, man. And I hope to be in the Shenandoah Valley in 2 weeks, and then I'll be more grounded. So thank you.
Oh my gosh. And thank you, John, Andy, thank you so much for being a part of this, for what you're doing. We'll get everything in the show notes. Music, Karen Green Zone Hero, big shout out. Thank you. We can't do this without you. And for everyone who's listening, like and subscribe. Oh, and good luck on your road, man. Keep
going.
doing the good work. Thank you for joining us on this episode of AHO Radio. Information we mentioned is probably in the show notes, but if we missed anything, please let us know and we'll get it added for you. Subscribe to the AHO Radio channel on YouTube to stay connected, and, as always, we wish you health, success, and significance. AHO!
AHO!
AHO!